Okay, so the question really arises, how do we explain the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 and Jesus' death and resurrection as opposed to Jesus' death and resurrection being found in the New Testament Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Jesus' death and resurrection being found all over the New Testament? Well, I want to draw attention to this book, The Postmortem Vindication of Jesus in the Saints Gospel Q, by Daniel A. Smith. Now, what is the Gospel Q? The Gospel Q, if we were to look up Wikipedia, the Q source, or Q from German Quell, meaning source, is an alleged written collection of primary Jesus sayings. Q is a part of a common material found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but not in the Gospel of Mark. According to this hypothesis, this material was drawn from the early church's oral gospel traditions. And here are the references right here. And so the Q gospel is the earliest gospel before Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, that was from the early church's oral gospel tradition. So the Q gospel most likely comes from the disciples of Jesus, the Aramaic speaking disciples of Jesus. Now, there's a case for Q and there's a case against Q. I'm with the opinion that there was a Q gospel. That's my hypothesis. That's my theory. And I think the strongest argument is found over here. Luke mentions that he knows other written sources of Jesus' life and he has investigated in order to gather the most information. So before the Gospel of Luke was written, in Luke chapter 1 verse 1 to 4, Luke was saying there are other documents about Jesus floating around in the earliest primitive period of the early church, of early Christianity, and Luke knows that there are other written sources of Jesus' life. So it's possible that the Q gospel existed before, the Gospel of Luke was written. And the fact that no Q manuscripts exist today does not necessarily argue against its existence. Many early Christian texts no longer exist, like the original autograph manuscript of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, etc. And they're only known through a citation or mention of them surviving text. Once Q's text was incorporated into the body of Matthew and Luke, it may have no longer been necessary to preserve it, just as interest in copying Mark seems to have waned substantially once it was incorporated into Matthew, and the reference is right there. So further it says scribes did not make new copies of Q since the canonizing process involved choosing what would and would not have been used in the church services. So, I'm with the opinion that I agree with this, with this line of reasoning that the Q gospel existed before the Gospel of Luke was written, but this Gospel of Q, whether it was written in Aramaic or Greek, was destroyed or lost as time went on, just like all the New Testament, original autographed New Testament manuscripts were lost and destroyed as, time went on. And the Q gospel, the Q gospel simply ceased to exist after it was copied into Matthew and Luke. So I believe the Q gospel existed. I'm using Wikipedia just to give like a general idea of what the Q gospel was, and I do agree with their line of reasoning. So they give reasons for Q's existence and Q's a case for Q and a case against Q, but I think the case for Q is a little bit stronger. But again, this is just a theory, and I think the theory does hold a lot of weight. So regardless, I believe Q existed, and I gave my reason and evidence right there. So getting back to what happened to Jesus and how this vindicates the Quran chapter 4 verse 1, or explains the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 and the Quran chapter 3 verse 55. Now, going to this book, The Postmortem Vindication of Jesus in the Saints Gospel Q, Shabir Ali brought this up in various debates, etc. So I think this person talks about the Q gospel. It's a commentary on the Q document, on the Q gospel, which we don't have today. So the important part comes in page 2 of this book, which I will get to right now. Now, unfortunately, this book is not available in its entirety. It's only available in certain pages in Google Documents. But I want to now, if we were to go here, right? it says, the important part comes over here, where, he talks about the Q's Jerusalem lament in Q 13, 34, and 35. It says, the main hypothesis of this study is the characteristic language and association assumption the body removal of a human being from earth to heaven at the end of their life is present in the saying. So assumption means someone being taken alive into heaven. And it's about somebody's disappearance from earth or teleportation from earth into heaven while they're still alive. So the Q gospel, and this is another important part, the Q gospel had nothing about Jesus' death and resurrection. The Q gospel mentions nothing about Jesus' passion, Jesus' alleged resurrection, etc., etc. The Q gospel talked about Jesus' assumption or Jesus' disappearance. And we see this right here. For Q 1335 predicts the disappearance of Jesus. You will not see me until the time comes. You will say, blessed is the coming one in the name of the Lord. The not seeing language is closely similar to that used in Hellenistic or Greek assumption stories in both Greek and Jewish traditions. The not seeing is temporary, however. Jesus will be seen again with acclamation. Further, it says the reading of Q 3435 along the lines was first proposed in 1985 by Dieter Zeller, a German scholar, and the idea has subsequently been taken up by a few others. This study fully investigates the implications for the theology of Q in reference to assumption and the saying. So Jesus is saying in the Jerusalem lament, you will not see me. Let me get to it. Jesus is predicting his disappearance and not his resurrection or his assumption into heaven. You will not see me until the time comes. Blessed is he coming in the name of the Lord. So the not seeing language is assumption language. And this is another important part. It says assumption, however, was usually considered a bodily removal from a person from earth into heaven while alive. So, the Jesus predicting his disappearance or assumption means Jesus will survive his crucifixion and will be taken up alive into heaven. Further, it says other aspects of Q are clarified reference to understanding the post-mortem vindication of Jesus. The basis of corporate vindication of Q can be reconsidered, particularly given significant parallels between non-earthly Jesus of Q and heavenly representatives, Second Temple Jerusalem literature. In addition, the sign of Jonah saying in Q 11, 29, 30 could possibly be illuminated if Q 1335 depicts Jesus as someone being rescued from death. So the Q gospel talked about the sign of Jonah as someone being rescued from death, and Q in the Jerusalem lament in Q 1335 depicts Jesus as someone being rescued from death. So if Jesus was rescued from death, that means Jesus is predicting, according to the Q gospel, his survival and his assumption alive into heaven. So that means Jesus survived the crucifixion. Jesus was alive in the tomb, and he was taken from the tomb into heaven. It says assumption, however, was considered a bodily removal of a person from earth while still alive. So Jesus was still alive after, or Jesus survived the crucifixion and survived being put in the tomb. Further, it says convictions about Jesus' vindication and return. Other texts from early Christianity suggest a similar view or were also investigated. The most significant text is Mark's empty tomb story in Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8, which describes the absence of Jesus' body from the tomb, but narrates no appearances of the risen one. The author of Mark, of course, the empty tomb signifies bodily resurrection, Mark 16:6, but the underlying source material seems to have described a bodily disappearance. This suggests the assumption as a mode of post-mortem vindication of Jesus had currency in a group other than the Q community. So, according to the Gospel of Mark, so according to the Gospel of Mark, Mark preserved the disappearance of Jesus and Jesus' appearance. In the empty tomb, Mark's empty tomb describes Jesus absent, or the absence of Jesus' body from the tomb, but narrates no appearance of the risen one. So Mark 16:1-8 talks about the disappearance of Jesus' body. That means that the earliest that the Gospel of Mark was talking about Jesus' disappearance, or Jesus' assumption into heaven, and not Jesus' resurrection from out of the tomb and into Galilee or Jerusalem, etc. So the Gospel of Mark ended with the women going to the empty tomb and seeing an empty tomb. So that means Jesus' body was already, or Jesus was taken from the tomb into heaven, according to the Gospel of Mark, and later Matthew, Luke, and John mixed both the disappearance and the resurrection narratives, but Mark preserved the disappearance of Jesus, as we've seen in Mark chapter 16, verses 1-8. So that means that Jesus, according to the Gospel of Mark preserved the disappearance tradition, and the later Gospels made up the resurrection narrative. So notice what he says here. It says, but the underlying source material seems to have described a bodily disappearance. So Jesus disappeared, or Jesus was assumed into heaven in the Gospel of Mark. And then we know that Mark 16:9-20 was added later on. It wasn't part of the original Gospel of Mark. It was added in the, I believe, 2nd or 3rd century, etc., to the manuscripts of Mark. This suggests, and notice what he says there, this suggests that the assumption as a mode of post-mortem vindication of Jesus had currency in a group other than the Q community. So Jesus' disappearance, or his assumption into heaven, was already circulating was already present in the Gospel of Mark. So the Q community passed it on to the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Mark preserved the disappearance tradition of Jesus disappearing, because the Gospel of Mark does not have Jesus' resurrection. It ends with the women going to the empty tomb and seeing an empty tomb. So that means that Paul is probably the one who made up Jesus' resurrection and not the disciples, since we know that Jesus' disciples and Paul got into fights with one another. They weren't preaching the same thing in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 4-6, if you read those verses. So it's very interesting that the Q gospel preserved Jesus' disappearance and assumption into heaven, as opposed to his resurrection from out of the tomb and into Jerusalem and Galilee. So Jesus disappeared, or Jesus was taken alive from the tomb into heaven. That explains the empty tomb. And the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, mixed up the disappearance and the disappearance narrative in Q and Paul's resurrection narrative. They mixed both those narratives together, and that's how we got Jesus' death and resurrection. The stories came from Paul, and the Q gospel talked about Jesus' rescue from death, and the Q gospel, rescue and assumption or disappearance alive into heaven. And Paul is the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection. But Paul is after the Q gospel, and the Q gospel probably came from the disciples who spoke Aramaic. And the Q gospel, again, had nothing about Jesus' death and resurrection, rather Jesus' rescue from death and his assumption into heaven, if we were to take into consideration what the Q gospel, what Daniel A. Smith talks about in the Q gospel, the Jerusalem lament and the sign of Jonah, which depicts Jesus as someone being rescued from death. If Jesus was rescued from death, that means he certainly survived his crucifixion, and he survived being put in the empty tomb, and from the tomb he was translated or assumed into heaven, or teleported into heaven. That explains the empty tomb. So the Q gospel preserved Jesus' disappearance and assumption, and Paul was the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection. So the Q gospel, which predates Paul, talks about Jesus' rescue from death and assumption into heaven, and Paul is the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection. So the Q gospel probably comes from the disciples. And the earliest Christian belief was that Jesus was rescued from death and taken alive into heaven. And Paul, the false apostle, was the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection. But there's no reason to believe in Paul, as Paul says that, hang on, let me pull up the verse right now. Oops. All right, hang on. Let me pull up the verse right now. So that's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11. For if someone comes for 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 4, it says, for if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preach, or if you receive a different spirit than the one you received, or a different gospel than the one you accept, you put up with it easily enough. So there were disciples preaching a Jesus different than what Paul was saying, because Paul says, for if someone preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, that means that there were disciples preaching a different Jesus than what Paul was preaching. So what is the Jesus that Paul was preaching? The Jesus dying and rising, or Jesus died for his sins and was resurrected. And Paul is saying they're disciples preaching a different Jesus, preaching a Jesus other than the Jesus that he's preaching. And he says, do not think I'm at least inferior to these super apostles. So the apostles, or Jesus' disciples, were the ones teaching a different Jesus than what Paul was preaching. And then so that goes back to the Q gospel. The earliest document, the earliest New Testament document that we have, or we know of, is the Q gospel. And again, like I said, the Q gospel probably comes from the disciples, and the Q gospel preserved the oral sayings of Jesus, and Jesus is talking about his rescue from death and his disappearance, or his assumption into heaven alive. So it goes, the Q gospel preserved Jesus' death, the Q gospel preserved Jesus' rescue from death and assumption into heaven alive. And Paul comes after and makes up the death and resurrection of Jesus, as Paul himself said that he was the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection, not the disciples, or Paul got it from his own revelations and not the disciples. We read in Galatians. We read in Galatians 1. What the hell? Where is it? Where is it? All right, let me just do it this way. We read in Galatians 1. Okay, so we read in Galatians chapter 1, verse 11, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preach is not of human origin. So Paul is admitting that his gospel is not from the disciples, because he says it's not of human origin. Then Paul says, I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. So Paul did not get Jesus' death and resurrection from the Peter, James, John, etc., nor was he taught it. So Paul was not taught, from Peter, James, Thomas, Bartholomew, etc., Jesus' original 12 disciples. It says, rather, I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ. So Paul is the one who's claiming that he's getting it from revelations of Jesus Christ, his own subjective revelations of Jesus Christ, and he wasn't taught it from the disciples. So Paul made up Jesus' death and resurrection, not the disciples, Peter, James, John, etc. And Paul's gospel, of course, beat out the Q gospel and Jesus' original followers' gospel. So that's how we got the death and resurrection narrative that we find in Matthew, Luke, and John. It came from Paul. In the rest of the New Testament documents, it comes from Paul and not the original disciples of Jesus. So this debunks. This is just my theory on the crucifixion of Jesus. What happened to him after the crucifixion? Jesus survives the crucifixion and is put in the tomb, according to the Gospel of Mark 16, and he is taken alive from the tomb into heaven. And so the Gospel of Mark preserved the disappearance of Jesus, or Jesus' assumption alive into heaven, and the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John made up Jesus' death and resurrection that came from, and they were influenced by Paul and not the earliest document Q, not the Q gospel, and the disciples of Jesus who were teaching a Jesus different than what Paul was preaching, according to 2 Corinthians. So stay tuned. More videos coming up ahead, debunking Christianity and various arguments Christians make for Jesus' death and resurrection.